The biting wind howls across the desolate prairie, whipping Alara's thin shawl tighter around her heavily pregnant form. Dusk bleeds purple and orange across the vast, unforgiving sky, a beautiful, cruel canvas for her despair. Two small children, Lily, no more than 6, and Tom, a sturdy 4, huddle against her legs, their faces pale with cold and exhaustion. They are not hers by blood, but they are hers by circumstance, by a desperate flight from a life too harsh to endure. Lost, with the chill of the high desert night seeping into their bones, Alara does the only thing she can think of to offer comfort, to herself as much as to them. She begins to sing, her voice a low, tremulous lullaby weaving through the mournful cry of the wind, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. It's an old song, one her own mother used to sing, about finding light in the deepest shadows. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments. What's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The children, shivering, lean closer, their small hands clutching her worn skirt. Lily's eyes are wide and fearful, reflecting the fading light. Tom has buried his face in Alara's side, his small body trembling. Every note Alara sings is a prayer, a plea cast into the wilderness. She knows, with a certainty that chills her more than the wind, that they cannot survive a night exposed like this. Her own unborn child stirs within her, a reminder of the precious, vulnerable life she carries. Another reason to fight against the overwhelming despair. The landscape offers no solace, only endless, rolling plains giving way to stark, rocky outcrops in the distance, indifferent to their plight. The sun dips lower, and the shadows lengthen, turning familiar shapes into monstrous specters. Just as her voice cracks, a new sound joins the symphony of the wind, the steady, rhythmic beat of hooves. A figure on horseback emerges from the gloom, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of the day. He pulls up a short distance away, the horse snorting softly, its breath misting in the cold air. For a long moment, he just sits there, listening, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Then, his voice, rough as granite but not unkind, cuts through the twilight. "Mom? You folks lost." Jedediah Stone had seen his share of hardship. His isolated ranch, nestled in a small, defensible hollow carved out by a seasonal creek, was a testament to solitary perseverance. Years had passed since laughter, other than his own rare, dry chuckle, had echoed within its sturdy log walls. A wife taken by fever, a son who'd never drawn his first breath. These were ghosts that walked with him, silent companions in his lonely existence. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet, to the rhythm of his own labor, the changing seasons his only calendar. He was heading back from checking a section of fence line, a task that usually offered a measure of grim satisfaction, when he heard it, a sound so out of place in this wilderness that he'd initially thought it was the wind playing tricks on his ears. A woman's voice, singing. And then, as he crested a small rise, he saw them. A woman, clearly with child, and two small figures clinging to her, huddled together like frightened quail. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. A man, alone, in this desolate place. Her hand instinctively went to the small, worn satchel at her side, though she knew it held nothing that could serve as a weapon. Her other arm tightened around Lily. We seem to have lost our way, sir," she managed, her voice still shaky, betraying more fear than she intended. She had been fleeing for weeks, ever since her brutish husband, Caleb, had died in a drunken brawl, and his even crueler brother, Silas, had made it clear he considered her and her late sister's orphan children, Lily and Tom, his property. Silas's eyes held a glint of malice and a different kind of hunger that had made Alara's skin crawl. She'd gathered what little she could, taken the children, and run, aiming for a distant cousin she hadn't seen in years, a pinprick of hope on a vast map of uncertainty. Their meager supplies had dwindled, their sense of direction lost in the sameness of the plains. Jed swung down from his horse, his movements economical and sure. He was a man not given to wasted gestures or words. He took in the sight before him, the woman's advanced pregnancy, the sheer terror in the children's eyes, the exhaustion etched onto all three faces. Their clothing was thin, inadequate for the coming night. He'd heard tales of Silas Blackwood, a hard man from a settlement 2 days' ride east, known for his temper and his grasping nature. He didn't know if these were the folk Silas might be missing, but the desperation in the woman's stance was palpable. His ranch wasn't a haven, and he wasn't looking for company, but he couldn't leave them out here. Not like this. The wind, he noticed, was picking up, carrying the first icy bite of what promised to be a bitter night. He remembered all too clearly the sting of such nights, even within the relative shelter of his cabin. To be caught out in it, especially with young ones, he thought of his own small, unmarked grave on the rise behind his cabin. "My place ain't far," he said, his voice still gruff, betraying none of the flicker of memory or the unwelcome stirring of compassion. "Got a fire, some stew. Not much, but it's warm." He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He saw need, and his response, ingrained by years of contending with the harsh realities of the frontier, was practical. He nodded towards his horse. "The little ones can ride with me. You can manage a short walk, ma'am?" Alara hesitated. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but the alternative was stark. A slow, freezing demise under the uncaring stars. The man's eyes, when she finally dared to meet them in the fading light, were steady, weathered, holding no discernible threat, only a kind of weary pragmatism. And the mention of a fire, of stew, was a siren song to their empty bellies and chilled bodies. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "We'd be grateful." The cabin was small, just one room, but it was sturdy, radiating a faint warmth even before Jed pushed open the heavy plank door. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bedroll lay in a corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 stools its main furnishings. It was Spartan, the abode of a man long alone, but to Alara, it looked like a palace. Jed helped Lily and Tom down from the horse, his large hands surprisingly gentle. The children, still wary, clung to Alara as soon as their feet touched the ground, their eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Jed didn't press them. He moved with an unhurried efficiency, lighting the kindling he'd laid in the hearth that morning. Soon, a small fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, its warmth a welcome embrace. He gestured towards the stools. "Sit. Rest." He ladled stew from a pot suspended over the embers into 3 chipped enamel bowls. It was simple fare, rabbit probably, with some wild onions and carrots, but it smelled like heaven. Alara sank onto a stool, pulling Lily onto her lap, Tom pressing close against her side. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the children's small, hungry sounds as they ate. Jed ate standing by the hearth, his gaze mostly fixed on the flames, though Alara felt his occasional, quick glances. He wasn't overtly curious, more like a man observing unfamiliar creatures that had wandered into his den. Later, after the meager meal was finished and the bowls scraped clean, Jed unrolled his bedroll near the fire. "You and the young uns take that," he said, nodding towards the narrow built-in bunk on the far wall, which had a thin mattress stuffed with straw and a couple of patched quilts. "I'll make do here." Alara felt a flush of gratitude, mixed with a lingering unease. "We don't want to impose, sir." "Name's Jed," he interrupted, his voice still flat. "And it's no imposition for a night. Better than freezing." He turned his back then, a clear dismissal, and settled onto his bedroll, facing the fire. Alara helped the children onto the bunk. Lily, exhausted, was asleep almost instantly. Her small face finally relaxed. Tom snuggled close, his thumb finding its way to his mouth. Alara lay down beside them, her body aching, her mind a whirl of anxieties. This man, Jed, had offered them shelter, a moment of respite. But what about tomorrow? And the day after? She was a burden, with 2 children and another on the way. The thought of Silas Blackwood, his leering face, his possessive claim, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She listened to Jed's steady breathing, the pop and hiss of the fire. Outside, the wind raged, a wild, lonely sound, but inside, for the first time in weeks, a fragile sense of safety began to take root. She was still lost, still fleeing, but for tonight, they were warm. For tonight, they were sheltered. And that, she realized, was more than she had dared to hope for. The next morning, a pale, watery sun did little to dispel the chill that had settled overnight. Jed was already up, tending the fire, a pot of something that smelled like cornmeal mush bubbling over the flames. The children were still asleep, huddled together under the quilts. Alara rose stiffly, her back protesting. "Morning," Jed grunted, not looking up from his task. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," Alara replied, her voice soft. "Thank you again for your kindness." He merely nodded. The silence stretched, comfortable for him, awkward for her. She felt the need to explain, to offer something, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That she was a fugitive, encumbered and desperate. It was Tom who broke the fragile peace of the morning. He woke with a small cry, his face flushed. When Alara touched his forehead, it was hot. A cough rattled in his small chest. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara. Illness on the trail was a death sentence. Here, in this isolated cabin, it felt scarcely less dire. "He's burning up," she said, her voice tight with worry, turning to Jed. Jed set down the ladle and came over. He looked at Tom, his expression unreadable, then gently placed a calloused hand on the boy's forehead. "Fever," he stated, his voice devoid of alarm but not unsympathetic. "Got some willow bark. Might help." He went to a small shelf, taking down a leather pouch. "Keep him warm. Give him water if he'll take it." For the next 2 days, Alara barely left Tom's side. She coaxed sips of willow bark tea and water between his lips, sponged his hot skin with cool water from the creek, and whispered soothing words, her own fears a constant, gnawing ache. Lily, subdued and worried, stayed close, sometimes patting her brother's hand. Through it all, Jed was a quiet, steady presence. He didn't offer empty platitudes, but he kept the fire going, ensured there was broth for Tom, and shared his meager rations without comment. He moved about his chores, chopping wood, tending his few chickens, mending a piece of tack with a quiet competence that was oddly reassuring. He spoke little, but Alara began to notice small things. The way he'd leave an extra piece of firewood near the hearth when the night promised to be particularly cold. The way his gaze would linger for a moment on the sleeping children, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he'd turn away. On the 3rd day, Tom's fever broke. He woke clear-eyed, demanding food, his small voice raspy but blessedly strong. The relief that flooded Alara was so immense it left her weak. She wept then, quiet, hiccuping sobs of gratitude and release, burying her face in Tom's tangled hair. When she looked up, Jed was standing in the doorway watching them. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a softness in his expression, a shadow of an old pain, perhaps, before his usual stoic mask slipped back into place. "He'll be all right," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. "Boy's a fighter," he paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You can stay, till he's stronger, till you figure things out." The unspoken invitation hung in the air. Alara knew she should leave, shouldn't impose further. But where would she go? Tom was still weak. Her own time was drawing nearer. The thought of facing the wilderness again, alone with the children and her impending labor, was terrifying. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. We won't be a burden for long." He just grunted and turned back to whatever task awaited him outside. But Alara felt a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. It wasn't just a temporary shelter anymore. It was, for now, a sanctuary. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Alara, as her strength returned and Tom regained his energy, tried to make herself useful. She mended Jed's worn shirts with neat, tiny stitches, her needle flashing in the firelight. She swept the packed earth floor of the cabin until it was spotless, tidied the few cluttered shelves, and learned to cook with the limited ingredients Jed had, stretching his supplies with a resourcefulness born of necessity. She discovered a small patch behind the cabin where a previous occupant, perhaps Jed's wife, had tried to cultivate a garden. With a rusty hoe Jed found in the lean-to, she began to turn the soil, hoping to plant a few late vegetables if she could find some seeds. The children slowly began to thaw. Lily, initially as silent and watchful as a startled fawn, started to venture small smiles in Jed's direction. Tom, with the resilience of childhood, soon saw Jed not as a threat but as a curiosity. He'd follow him as he did his chores, asking a stream of questions in his piping voice. "What's that for, Jed? Can I help, Jed?" Jed, to Alara's surprise, answered with gruff patience, sometimes even letting Tom help by carrying a small piece of wood or fetching a tool. She saw him once, when he thought no one was looking, whittling a small, crude bird for Tom, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. He'd thrust it at the boy later with a mumbled, "Here," and Tom had clutched it like a treasure. Evenings became a time of quiet companionship. After the simple meal, Alara would often sing softly to the children as they drifted off to sleep in the bunk. Sometimes, she would choose the old lullabies, the ones tinged with sorrow and longing. Other times, she'd sing hymns, her voice gaining a quiet strength. Jed would sit by the fire, mending tack or sharpening his knife, seemingly engrossed in his task. But Alara noticed he would pause in his work, his head tilted slightly, listening. One evening, as she sang a half-forgotten folk song about a winding river journey, she heard a low hum join her melody. It was Jed, his voice a rough baritone, hesitant at first, then finding the tune. He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the fire, but the shared song filled the small cabin with an unexpected warmth, a fragile harmony that spoke of connection deeper than words. When the song ended, a comfortable silence settled between them. Alara felt a blush creep up her neck. Jed cleared his throat and poked at the fire, but the shared moment lingered, a small, glowing ember in the quiet darkness. Jed found himself increasingly unsettled by the changes in his life. The silence he had once cherished now felt empty when Alara wasn't humming softly as she worked, or when the children weren't chattering. He'd catch himself watching Alara as she moved about the cabin, her pregnant form graceful despite its heaviness, her face, though still etched with worry, often softened by a gentle expression as she tended to the children. He saw the strength in her, the quiet resilience that had carried her this far. He saw the love she bore for Lily and Tom, a fierce, protective love that reminded him, achingly, of what he had lost. He hadn't realized how deep his loneliness ran until their presence began to fill the void. The thought of them leaving, which he knew was inevitable, now carried a sharp pang he hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, Jed rode into the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town, a half-day's journey from his ranch, to trade some pelts for supplies. The air in Miller's mercantile was thick with the scent of coffee, leather, and local gossip. As old Miller tallied his goods, a newcomer, a rough-looking man with shifty eyes, was talking loudly to a couple of loafers by the stove. "Looking for a woman," the man was saying. "Dark hair with child. Got 2 young uns with her. Name of Alara." Run off from her kin, Silas Blackwood. Good man, Silas. Offering a reward. Jed's blood ran cold. He kept his face impassive, paid Miller, and gathered his supplies, but the man's words echoed in his mind. Silas Blackwood. He'd heard the name, and the tales attached to it weren't of a good man, they were of a bully, a cheat, quick with his fists and greedy for what wasn't his. Alara. Her name, spoken by that coarse voice, felt like a violation. He knew, with a grim certainty, that this Silas Blackwood was the shadow she was fleeing. The bounty hunter's presence meant the shadow was drawing closer. The ride back to the ranch was fraught with a new urgency. The wind seemed to whisper warnings, the landscape suddenly more menacing. He had to tell Alara. They had to make a plan. His isolated ranch, once a refuge, now felt dangerously exposed. He found Alara by the creek, helping Lily and Tom sail leaf boats in a shallow eddy. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwoods, dappling them in gold. For a moment, they looked like a painting of peace, a scene so far removed from the ugly reality he carried that his heart ached. The children's laughter, usually a sound that brought an unexpected lightness to his chest, now felt fragile, vulnerable. He waited until the children were asleep that night, their small faces serene in the firelight. Alara was mending one of Tom's torn trousers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Alara, he began, his voice unusually strained. She looked up, her eyes questioning. He told her what he'd heard in town, the description, the name Silas Blackwood, the reward. He watched as the color drained from her face, her eyes widening with a familiar terror he was beginning to despise. Her hands stilled in her lap, the needle forgotten. Silas, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He won't stop. He considers us his. The story tumbled out then, fragments of a brutal life. Caleb's drunken rages, Silas's cold cruelty after his brother's death, his chilling pronouncements about his rights to her sister's children, to the small, barren piece of land that had belonged to Caleb. She spoke of her fear for Lily and Tom, her fear for her unborn child, her desperate, ill-planned flight. Jed listened, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The image of this woman, pregnant and alone, shepherdessing two small children through the wilderness to escape such a man, filled him with a cold fury and a profound, unwilling admiration. He won't find you here, Jed said, his voice a low growl, more statement of intent than reassurance. This is my land. He's got no claim here. But the reward, Jed, men will look. He'll pay them well. Alara's voice trembled. I can't put you in danger. We have to leave. In the morning. Leave. Jed stared at her, the thought a sudden, unwelcome jolt. Where would you go? You're in no condition to travel far, not with winter coming on and the baby due soon. He looked at her swollen belly, a silent testament to her vulnerability. And those bounty hunters won't care about any of that. Panic welled in Alara's eyes. But I can't stay. I can't let him hurt you, or take the children. He won't, Jed said, his voice firm. He rose and began to pace the small cabin, the confines suddenly too restrictive for the storm brewing inside him. He stopped before her, looking down at her pale, frightened face. An idea, drastic and sudden, yet strangely right, formed in his mind. It was a mad notion, born of desperation and a burgeoning protectiveness he could no longer deny. There's one way, he said slowly, testing the words. One way to give you and the children protection. A claim even Silas Blackwood would have to respect, or face the law himself. Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. What is it? Jed took a deep breath. Marry me, Alara. The words hung in the air, stunning Alara into silence. Marry him? A man she barely knew, a stranger who had offered her shelter out of pity, or perhaps a sense of gruff duty. Her mind reeled. Marriage, for her, had been a cage, a source of pain and fear. Yet this man, Jedediah Stone, was nothing like Caleb. He was quiet, yes, and solitary, but there was a core of decency in him, a steadfastness she had come to rely on, even in their short acquaintance. And his offer, however startling, was undeniably a shield. As Jed's wife, she and the children would have a legal protector. Silas's claim would be weakened, if not nullified. "Marry you?" she echoed, her voice a whisper. "But why? You don't know me. I know you're in trouble," Jed interrupted, his gaze steady. "I know you're a good woman trying to protect those young uns. And I know Silas Blackwood is a buzzard who'll pick you clean if he gets the chance." He ran a hand through his already tousled hair. "It wouldn't have to be a real marriage. Not in all ways. Just a name. Protection. Until you're safe. Until you can decide what you truly want to do." His offer was pragmatic, almost businesslike, yet Alara sensed something more beneath the surface. A loneliness that mirrored her own. A hesitant desire for connection he couldn't quite voice. She looked at Lily and Tom, sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the danger that circled them. For their sake, for the sake of the child she carried, could she do this? Could she trade one unknown for another, hoping this time it would lead to safety instead of sorrow? "The circuit judge passes through Prairie Dog Creek next week," Jed continued, filling the silence. "We could ride over. Make it official." Alara took a shaky breath. The alternative was to run again, deeper into the wilderness, with winter approaching and Silas's men on their trail. It was no choice at all. If you're sure, Jed," she said, her voice small but resolute. "For the children's sake. And for the baby." A flicker of something, relief, crossed Jed's face. "I'm sure," he said. He didn't offer comfort, didn't touch her, but his presence suddenly felt more solid, a bulwark against the threatening storm. "Get some rest, Alara. We'll face this together." The decision, once made, settled a strange kind of calm over Alara. The fear of Silas was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by a fragile hope. Jed, true to his word, began to make preparations. He checked his rifle, counted his ammunition, and spent an afternoon reinforcing the cabin door with a heavy wooden bar. He spoke little of Silas or the threat, but his actions were eloquent. He was preparing to defend them. Alara watched him, a complex mix of gratitude and apprehension stirring within her. This quiet, solitary man was willing to stand between her and her past, to offer his name and his protection to a woman and children who were, until a short while ago, complete strangers. The days leading up to the circuit judge's arrival were filled with a tense anticipation. Alara found herself observing Jed more closely, trying to understand the man she was about to marry. She saw the kindness in his rough hands when he helped Tom retrieve a toy from a high shelf, the patience in his voice when he explained to Lily how a bird built its nest. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes when he thought no one was looking, and the deep loneliness that clung to him like the scent of wood smoke. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a quiet integrity, a deep-seated sense of right and wrong. She began to realize that his offer of marriage, while pragmatic, was not made lightly. It was a commitment, and he intended to honor it. The journey to Prairie Dog Creek was uneventful, though Alara's anxiety grew with every mile. Jed rode with Tom in front of him, while Lily rode Alara's borrowed mare, a gentle old nag Jed usually used for light pack work. Alara herself rode Jed's steady saddle horse, her pregnant belly making the ride uncomfortable despite the slow pace. Prairie Dog Creek was little more than a dusty crossroads with a general store, a saloon, and a ramshackle building that served as a temporary courthouse when Judge Peabody came through. The town was buzzing with a rough crowd, ranchers, prospectors, a few drifters, all drawn by the judge's visit. Alara pulled her shawl tighter, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the curious stares of the townsfolk. Jed, however, moved with a quiet confidence, his presence a shield. He secured their horses and led them towards the makeshift courthouse. Judge Peabody was a portly man with a booming voice and shrewd eyes. He listened to Jed's request for a marriage license with a raised eyebrow, his gaze lingering on Alara's swollen form and the two small children clinging to her skirts. Jed offered no elaborate explanations, just stated his intention to marry Alara, providing his name and hers. He paid the fee, and the judge, after a few perfunctory questions, began to fill out the paperwork. The ceremony itself was brief, almost stark. Standing before the judge in the dusty room, with Lily and Tom as silent, wide-eyed witnesses, Alara and Jed exchanged simple vows. I, Jedediah Stone, take thee, Alara, to be my wedded wife. I, Alara Sims, take thee, Jedediah, to be my wedded husband. There were no rings, no flowers, no well-wishers. Just the judge's booming pronouncement. By the authority vested in me by the territory, I now pronounce you man and wife. As they stepped out of the courthouse, blinking in the harsh sunlight, Alara felt a strange sense of unreality. She was Mrs. Jedediah Stone. The name felt foreign on her tongue, yet it carried a weight, a significance that was undeniable. Jed bought some candy for the children at the general store, a small, unexpected treat that brought smiles to their faces. He also purchased a few extra supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and a bolt of sturdy calico cloth. He didn't say it was for her, but Alara knew it was. It was a gesture of provision, of care. Their return journey to the ranch was quiet. Alara rode beside Jed, her mind preoccupied. The legal bond was forged, but the emotional landscape between them remained largely uncharted territory. Back at the cabin, nothing seemed overtly different, yet everything had changed. Jed still slept on his bedroll by the fire, Alara and the children in the bunk. But now, when he looked at her, there was a new awareness in his eyes, a sense of shared responsibility, perhaps even a hesitant tenderness. Alara, too, felt a shift within herself. The fear of Silas was still a cold shadow, but it no longer consumed her. She had a husband, a protector. She had a name that offered a measure of safety. And in the quiet solitude of Jed's cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, she began to feel the first, tentative stirrings of something that might, one day, resemble peace. A week later, just as the aspen leaves were turning a brilliant gold and the nights grew sharper with the promise of frost, trouble arrived. Alara was outside, hanging some mended clothes on a line stretched between two trees, Lily and Tom playing nearby, their laughter a bright sound in the crisp autumn air. Jed was further up the creek, checking his traps. A prickle of unease made Alara look up. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, not from the direction of the town, but from the east, the direction from which she had fled. Her blood ran cold. One of them, stout and florid-faced, with a mean set to his mouth, she recognized instantly. Silas Blackwood. Alara! Silas's voice, oily and possessive, cut through the quiet afternoon. Thought you could hide from me, did you, girl? And take what's mine. His eyes swept over Lily and Tom, then lingered on Alara's pregnant form with a predatory gleam. The other 2 men, rough-looking and heavily armed, fanned out slightly, their expressions hard. Fear, sharp and sickening, clawed at Alara. She grabbed Lily and Tom, pulling them behind her. "They're not yours, Silas," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "And neither am I." Silas chuckled, a nasty sound. "We'll see about that. You're Caleb's widow. That makes you and his leavings my responsibility. My property." He dismounted, his movements arrogant and confident. "Come along now. Don't make this difficult." Just then, Jed appeared, walking down from the creek, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his expression unreadable. He'd heard the voices, seen the riders. He moved without haste, but with a deadly purpose that made the air crackle. "She ain't going anywhere with you, Blackwood," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. He stopped a few paces from Alara and the children, placing himself between them and Silas. Silas's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be, interfering in family matters?" "Name's Jedediah Stone," Jed replied, his gaze unwavering. "And this is my wife, Alara Stone. These are her children. This is our home." The declaration, spoken with such quiet certainty, stunned Silas into momentary silence. His face flushed an ugly red. "Your wife?" he scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. She's a runaway. A thief." "She's my wife," Jed repeated, his voice like flint. "Got the paper to prove it, signed by Judge Peabody himself. You got no claim on her or the children. Now, I suggest you and your men turn around and ride out. You're trespassing." Silas's face contorted with rage. "Paper or no paper, she belongs with her kin. Those brats are Blackwood blood, in a manner of speaking." He took a step forward, his hand moving towards the pistol at his hip. Jed brought his rifle up, not aiming, but the message was clear. "Take another step, Blackwood, and you'll regret it." His voice was calm, almost conversational, but with an underlying current of deadly intent that even Silas, in his bluster, couldn't ignore. The two men with Silas shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Jed and their employer. They were hired muscle, not men looking to die for Silas Blackwood's dubious claims against a man who clearly knew how to handle a rifle and was defending his home. Alara, her heart pounding, stepped forward slightly, her hand resting on Jed's arm. "He's telling the truth, Silas," she said, her voice gaining strength from Jed's steadfast presence. "I'm Mrs. Stone now. We're married. You have no rights here." The sight of Alara, defiant and protected, seemed to enrage Silas further. "You think this changes anything, you little tramp?" he snarled, his face mottled with fury. "You think this sodbuster can keep you from me?" Suddenly, as Silas postured, Alara felt a sharp, intense pain low in her belly, followed by a gush of warmth down her legs. She gasped, her hand flying to her abdomen. The baby. It was coming. Now. Jed saw her face pale, saw her stumble. His attention, for a fraction of a second, wavered. "Alara?" It was the opening Silas needed. With a roar, he lunged, not at Jed, but at Alara, trying to grab her arm. "You're coming with me." Jed reacted instantly. He swung the butt of his rifle in a short, vicious arc, connecting with Silas's shoulder. Silas howled in pain and stumbled back, clutching his arm. Before he could recover, Jed leveled the rifle at his chest. "Get off my land, Blackwood," Jed gritted out, his eyes blazing. "Now, before I forget I'm a civilized man." The two hired guns, seeing their employer injured and Jed's cold fury, had no stomach for a fight. They exchanged a look, then began to back their horses away. Silas, cradling his shoulder, shot Jed a look of pure hatred. "This ain't over, Stone. You hear me? This ain't over." But his bluster was gone. He was hurt, outnumbered in spirit if not in fact, and he knew he'd lost this round. He painfully remounted his horse, and with a final glare, turned and rode away, his men following sheepishly. As soon as they were out of sight, Jed lowered his rifle and rushed to Alara's side. She was leaning heavily against the cabin wall, her face ashen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "The baby?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and fear. "It's coming." Jed swore under his breath, not in anger, but in alarm. He scooped her into his arms, his earlier weariness forgotten, and carried her into the cabin, shouting for Lily to fetch clean cloths and water. He laid Alara gently on the bunk, his mind racing. He'd helped birth calves, foals, even lambs, but never a human child. He was terrified, but he couldn't let Alara see it. He had to be strong for her, for them. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, fear, and desperate effort. Jed, guided by Alara's weakening instructions and his own rough knowledge, did his best. Lily, brave beyond her years, brought water and cloths, her small face etched with worry. Tom, frightened by the sounds and the tension, huddled in a corner, clutching the small wooden bird Jed had carved for him. Alara, caught in the throes of labor, fought with a primal strength, her cries tearing at Jed's heart. He held her hand, wiped her brow, spoke words of encouragement he wasn't sure he believed himself. He prayed, a desperate, disjointed plea to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. And then, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of blood orange and deep violet, a new sound filled the small cabin. The thin, wailing cry of a newborn child. Exhausted but triumphant, Alara sank back against the pillows Jed had propped behind her, a radiant smile illuminating her pale face. Jed, his hands trembling, gently cleaned the baby, a small, perfect girl, and wrapped her in a clean cloth Alara had laid out. He placed the infant in Alara's waiting arms. "A daughter, Alara," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a daughter." Alara looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, her eyes filled with an overwhelming love. "She's beautiful," she whispered. She looked up at Jed, her gaze soft and filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you, Jed, for everything." He could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He looked at Alara, her face luminous even in her exhaustion, at the tiny baby nestled in her arms, at Lily and Tom, who were now peeking shyly at their new sister. The cabin, once a place of solitude and quiet sorrow, was now filled with new life, with the sounds of a family. The threat of Silas Blackwood, though perhaps not gone forever, seemed distant, insignificant in the face of this miracle. In that moment, standing in the warm glow of the firelight, surrounded by this woman and these children who had unexpectedly become his life, Jedediah Stone knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was no longer alone. He had found his family. The immediate aftermath was a period of quiet wonder and profound relief. Silas Blackwood did not return. Word, perhaps carried by his own chastened men, might have spread that Alara Stone was now under the firm protection of her husband, a man not to be trifled with. Or perhaps Silas, nursing his injured shoulder and his pride, simply decided the prize was no longer worth the risk. Whatever the reason, a fragile peace settled over the small ranch. Jed moved with a new lightness, the habitual lines of worry on his face softened. He watched Alara with the baby, a tiny, dark-haired girl they named Hope, with a tenderness that surprised even himself. He found himself humming as he went about his chores, the old, mournful tunes replaced by something more hopeful. Alara healed quickly, her strength returning day by day, buoyed by happiness and a sense of security she had never known. The baby thrived, a content and healthy infant who rarely cried. Lily and Tom adored their new sister, taking turns to gently rock her makeshift cradle, a sturdy wooden box Jed had lined with soft furs, or to simply gaze at her in wonder. The cabin, once so quiet, was now filled with the gentle sounds of a family. Hope's soft coos, Lily's chatter, Tom's boisterous laughter, and Alara's voice, often raised in a soft lullaby, no longer tinged with fear, but with a deep, abiding contentment. Jed, without a word, moved his bedroll from its place by the fire to the floor beside the bunk where Alara and Hope slept. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a declaration of his place, his commitment. One evening, as Alara nursed Hope, the firelight casting a warm glow over them, Jed sat mending a bridle, the silence comfortable, companionable. "She looks like you, Alara," he said softly, his gaze on the baby. Alara smiled. "She has your eyes, I think. That same steady look." A faint blush rose on Jed's weathered cheeks. He cleared his throat. "Reckon we made a good team, you and I, facing down Blackwood, bringing this little one into the world." "We did, Jed," Alara said, her voice gentle. "You saved us. You gave us a home." "You gave me one too, Alara," he admitted, his voice gruff with emotion. "This place, it was just a cabin before. Now," he trailed off, unable to articulate the profound change that had occurred within him, within these four walls. Alara understood. She reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture of quiet affection, of shared understanding. His calloused fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. The harsh winter they had dreaded arrived, blanketing the prairie in a thick layer of snow, isolating them further. But inside the small cabin, there was warmth and food, and a growing sense of belonging. Jed taught Tom how to set simple snares for rabbits, and Lily how to identify different animal tracks in the snow. Alara, using the calico Jed had bought, sewed new clothes for the children, and a small dress for Hope. They shared stories by the fire, Jed recounting tales of his early days on the frontier, Alara speaking of her childhood, carefully omitting the darker parts of her more recent past. The children, secure in the love that surrounded them, blossomed. Tom's initial shyness with Jed had long since vanished, replaced by an open adoration. He followed Jed everywhere, his Pa Jed as he now often called him, mimicking his movements, his small face serious as he tried to help with chores. Lily, quieter but no less devoted, would often sit beside Jed as he worked, content just to be near him. One clear, cold afternoon, Jed bundled up Hope and took her outside, walking slowly around the snow-covered yard. Alara watched from the doorway, Lily and Tom flanking her, their breath misting in the frosty air. Jed held the baby close, his large frame a protective shield against the cold, his gruff voice uncharacteristically soft as he pointed out a chickadee flitting in the bare branches of a cottonwood. He looked up and met Alara's gaze, a slow smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually stern features. In that moment, Alara knew, with a certainty that warmed her to her soul, that this was more than a marriage of convenience, more than a haven from a storm. This was love, grown slowly, quietly, in the harsh soil of the wilderness, nurtured by shared hardship and unexpected kindness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and lavender, Jed came back inside, Hope now gurgling happily in his arms. He handed her to Alara, his fingers brushing hers. The children were already setting out the bowls for supper, their movements practiced, familiar. The aroma of venison stew, rich and savory, filled the cabin. Jed took his place at the rough-hewn table, and Alara sat opposite him, Hope settled on her lap. Lily and Tom scrambled onto their stools. It was a simple scene, a family gathered for their evening meal. Yet for Jed and Alara, it was everything. He looked at Alara, her face serene in the lamplight, at the children, their faces bright with health and happiness. He thought of the lonely, grieving man he had been, wandering his empty ranch, his heart a barren landscape. And then he thought of a pregnant woman, singing to lost children at dusk, her voice a fragile beacon in the wilderness. He had joined in her song, and in doing so had found his own. He reached across the table and took her hand. "We're home, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Alara's eyes shone. She squeezed his hand, her smile radiant. "Yes, Jed," she whispered. "We're finally home," the wind howled outside, but inside the small log cabin, surrounded by the quiet love of a family forged in adversity, there was only warmth and peace and the promise of a shared future. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.